The moon hung low over Rome, bathing the marble streets in pale light. A crowd gathered around the Senate steps, murmuring like restless thunder. They weren't here for war or spectacle, but for words that could sway empires. At the center stood Lucius Varro, a man whose voice once commanded legions, whose speeches stirred hearts and sparked revolutions. But tonight he stood silent. His enemies mocked him. "What's wrong, Varro?" they jeered. "Has the mighty tongue of Rome forgotten its strength?" Lucius didn't reply. He had learned something that few ever do, that silence can strike deeper than any argument. Months earlier, Lucius had been the emperor's most trusted orator, the golden voice of the empire. Crowds filled the amphitheaters to hear him speak, and his words could crush opposition. But his pride grew faster than his wisdom. In one fatal speech, he publicly questioned the emperor's decision, a single sentence wrapped in arrogance. Within hours, he was stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity. Exiled to a small farm outside Rome, Lucius raged. "My voice built their empire," he shouted to the fields. "How dare they silence me?" But no one answered. The only sound was the wind passing through the olive trees. Days became months. Alone, Lucius began to notice something he had ignored all his life: the power of quiet. He watched the rhythm of nature, the stillness before dawn, the way the world spoke without words. One morning, while working in the fields, he met an old monk named Marcus, a philosopher of the Stoic school. Marcus watched Lucius struggle with the soil and said, "The loudest man in the room is often the weakest." Lucius frowned. "You think silence makes a man strong?" "No," Marcus said, "but it reveals his strength." From that day forward, Marcus visited often. They would sit under the olive trees, and the old monk would speak of emperors and slaves, victories and failures, all undone by the same flaw: the need to speak, to prove, to win. "You once spoke to change the world," Marcus said. "Now learn to listen to it." As the seasons passed, Lucius changed. His anger turned into reflection. He realized how much of his life had been noise, defending, arguing, persuading. But real control, he discovered, comes not from saying more, but from knowing when to say nothing. One evening, the emperor's soldiers arrived. "Lucius Varro," the captain said, "the emperor requests your presence." In the great hall of Rome, Lucius stood before his old master. The emperor, older now, looked at him with unreadable eyes. "You've been silent for 2 years," he said. "Tell me, what has silence taught you?" Lucius replied, "It taught me that a man who cannot master his tongue will never master his mind." The emperor smiled faintly. "Then perhaps your voice can serve Rome once more, not as a weapon, but as a mirror." And so Lucius returned, not as an orator, but as a teacher of discipline, self-control, and inner strength. The man who once conquered crowds now conquered himself. The winter winds swept through Rome like whispers of forgotten gods. Lucius Varro walked the palace gardens, no longer dressed in fine robes, no longer seeking attention. His hands rough from tending olive trees, his heart calm. He had learned to listen, to the rustle of leaves, to the rhythm of his breath, to the space between thoughts where peace begins. He no longer chased applause or validation. The noise that once ruled him had vanished, but fate was waiting for him to be ready. One cold night, while the emperor held council with his advisors, a messenger burst into the hall. "Assassins!" he cried. "They've entered the lower chambers." Panic erupted. Guards rushed, blades clashed, torches flickered wildly. Lucius was in the outer garden when he heard the chaos. He grabbed his lantern and ran toward the sound. At the end of the marble corridor, he saw Cassius Nero, the same senator who once betrayed him, leading masked men toward the emperor's chamber. Lucius stepped into their path. The men halted. Cassius sneered. "Step aside, gardener. This doesn't concern you." Lucius said nothing. His silence made Cassius hesitate. "Do you think your quiet can stop us?" Cassius barked. "Say something, coward." Lucius didn't move. He simply raised his lantern, and behind him, reflections of armored guards appeared in the polished marble walls. Cassius turned too late. The guards had already surrounded them. Lucius's silence had spoken louder than words ever could. At dawn, the rebellion was crushed. Cassius was imprisoned, and the emperor's life had been saved by a man who no longer needed to speak to be heard. Marcus summoned Lucius to the great hall. "You once said that speech is the sword of civilization," the emperor said softly. Lucius nodded. "I was wrong," Marcus smiled. "No, you were young. You saw only one edge of the sword. Silence is the other." He placed a hand on Lucius's shoulder. "The world is full of men who speak to be seen, but few are brave enough to be quiet. You have become one of them." Lucius bowed. "I learned that silence is not weakness. It is control over oneself," the emperor said, "and that is true power." Years passed. Lucius became a counselor, not for his speeches, but for his presence. When senators argued, they looked to him, waiting for his calm eyes to settle the storm. When the emperor faced impossible choices, Lucius would listen first, and speak only when the silence begged for meaning. Every time he spoke, people listened. He had once been a man who shouted to be heard. Now he was the man whose silence demanded attention. One afternoon, a young philosopher approached him. "Master Varro," he said, "what is the greatest strength a man can possess?" Lucius looked at him and replied, "The strength to stay silent when your ego demands to speak." "But isn't silence empty?" the boy asked. Lucius smiled. "It is, and in that emptiness, the soul finally breathes." That night, Lucius sat in his chamber, writing his final notes on the philosophy of stillness. He dipped his quill and wrote the words that would outlive him. "Noise seeks attention. Silence commands it. To speak less is to hear more, not of others, but of truth itself." He closed his journal, placed it beside the small lantern that had once exposed betrayal, and whispered into the darkness, "The voice of silence is eternal." The flame flickered once and went out. Silence is not the absence of power, it is power. It is mastery of emotion, victory over impulse, and the bridge between wisdom and action. Words may impress the world, but silence transforms the soul. The quieter you become, the stronger you grow.